Welcome on GAM channel. Please subscribe, like, share and comment. So today in this video you're going to know the history of Eritrea from the 1940s up to 1980s and the main personalities of Eritrea. Before I go on to the 1940s history, let's just go back a little bit to the Italian Eritrea so we can go on with how Eritrea came under a British military. Italian Eritrea was a colony of the Kingdom of Italy in the territory of present-day Eritrea. Occupation of Massawa in 1885 and the subsequent expansion of territory would gradually engulf the region, and in 1889 borders with the Ethiopian Empire were defined in the Treaty of Woolchal. In 1890 the colony of Eritrea was officially founded. In 1936 the region was integrated into Italian East Africa as Eritrea Governorate. This would last until Italy's loss of the region in 1941. During the East African campaign of World War II, Italian Eritrea then came under British military administration, which in 1951 fell under United Nations supervision. British forces defeated the Italian army in Eritrea in 1941 at the Battle of Keren and placed the colony under British military administration until Allied forces could determine its fate. Several Italian-built infrastructure projects and industries were dismantled and removed to Kenya as war reparations. In the absence of agreement amongst the Allies concerning the status of Eritrea, the British military administration continued for the remainder of World War II until 1950. During the immediate post-war years, the British proposed that Eritrea be divided along religious lines, with the Muslim population joining Sudan and Christians Ethiopia, the Soviet Union, anticipating an Italian Communist Party victory in the Italian polls. Initially supported returning Eritrea to Italy under trusteeship as a colony. Soviet diplomats led Maxim Litvinov and backed by Ivan Maisky and Vyacheslav Molotov even attempted to have Eritrea become a trustee of the Soviet Union itself. Arab states, seeing Eritrea and its large Muslim population as an extension of the Arab world, sought the establishment of an independent state. There are only two main Christian-Muslim conflicts reported in Asmara, Eritrea. One was in 1946 where Sudanese defense forces were involved, and other was in February in 1950. This note is about that of 1950. The UN Commission arrived in Eritrea on February 9 and began its months-long inquiry 5 days later. Unionist shifter activities supported by Ethiopia increased after its arrival. They became daring, better planned, better coordinated and innovative. The main target of the shifter was to disrupt the free movement of the UNC in areas controlled by the independent bloc supporters. The shifter attempted to prevent the rural population that supported independence from having an audience with the UNSC. They targeted transportation and communication systems. Telephone lines connecting Asmara with major cities of the predominantly areas pro-independence areas of the western lowlands and Massawa were continuously cut. An active Muslim League local leader from Mai Derese, Bashai Nesreddin Said, was killed by the Unionist shifter while praying on February 20. According to an account of the incident written by Mufti Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Mutar, at 7:30 in the morning of a Monday that date, 5 shifter came and fired several bullets at him while he was praying. He was murdered. The reason for the killing was that they had asked him to abandon the Muslim League and join the Unionist Party, but he refused. The killing sparked an outrage amongst Muslims in Asmara, and a lot of people turned up the next day for his funeral to show their stand against the terrorist activities of the UP. A well-organized funeral procession was arranged and attended by youth and Muslim dignitaries. The procession passed through 3 main streets before they reached the street where the UP office was located. According to the Mufti, then the UP members started first to throw stones at the procession, which was followed by 3 grenades, and the chaos followed. There was open confrontation between both sides and many were killed and injured from both sides. The police intervened by firing live ammunition, but the confrontations continued. Despite all this, the processions continued to the cemetery where the body was buried. The riots then spread to other areas areas and took a dangerous sectarian form. Many properties were also looted and burned. On Wednesday, the British military administration declared a curfew from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., but the riots continued on Friday and curfew was extended to 22 hours. On Thursday, the BMA administrator called for a meeting that included the Mufti and Abuna Marcos and asked them to calm the people and asked for reconciliation, and both agreed. The next day, a convoy of 4 cars. In the first car were armed police, and in the second was the Asmar administrator with his Arabic translator. In the third were the Mufti and the Abuna, and in the fourth was the Asmara and Hamsain judge and the vice of the Abuna. Moved to the districts of Jeza, Berhanu, Edgar, Arbi, Ahiria, Edgar, Hamus, Abu Shaul, Hadish, Adi, and Jaza Banda. In each location, people were addressed with microphones together in both Arabic and Tigrinya, and were told that the police will not harm them. In places where there were a majority of Christians, the Abuna will address them first and later the Mufti, calling the people to end the violence, and vice versa in the other locations where the majority were Muslims. Later, the people were told to go back to their homes. In the evening, the Mufti and the Abuna went to the radio station and advised the citizens to end violence. The wise men from both sides accepted the call, but the looting of properties of Muslim nations continued for 3 more days before the riots came to an end. On Saturday, 25th February, the Kurds met at the main church and Muslims at the Grand Mosque and discussed ways to end violence. Both sides agreed to take an oath to prevent violence against each other. Each side appointed a 4-member committee to oversee the agreements. Later, 31 members from each side took an oath in front of the 8-member committee to prevent further violence in other areas. The committee of both sides decided to visit the Muslim and Christian cemeteries and laid flowers on the graveyard of the victims of both sides. More than 62 persons were killed and more than 180 were injured, and the damage on the properties was huge. These were the riots where the Ethiopian liaison officer played a big role to ignite was brought to an end by the wise religious leaders and elders of both sides. Ethiopian ambition in the Horn was apparent. In the expansionist ambition of its monarch, the Haile Selassie claimed Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. He made this claim in letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Paris Peace Conference and at the first session of the United Nations. The United Nations, the debate over the fate of the former Italian colonies continued. The British and Americans preferred to cede Eritrea to the Ethiopians, if possible, as a reward for their support during World War II. The United States and the United Kingdom have agreed to support cessation to Ethiopia of all Eritrea except the Western Province. The United States has given assurance to Ethiopia in this regard. The independence bloc of Eritrean parties consistently requested from the UN General Assembly that a referendum be held immediately to settle the Eritrean question of sovereignty. The United Nations Commission was dispatched to the former colony in February 1950 in the absence of valid agreement and in the face of Eritrean demands for self-determination. It was also at this juncture that the US ambassador to the UN, John Foster Dulles, said, "From the point of view of justice, the opinions of the Eritrean people must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interest of the United States in the Red Sea Basin and the consideration of security and world peace make it necessary that the country has to be linked with our ally Ethiopia." The ambassador's word choice, along with the estimation of the British ambassador in Addis Ababa, makes quite clear the fact that Eritrean aspiration was for independence. The Commission proposed the establishment of some form of association with Ethiopia, and the UN General Assembly on 2 December 1950 adopted the proposal along with a provision determining the British military administration of Eritrea on later than 15 September 1952. The British military administration held legislative assembly elections on 25th and 26th March 1952 for a representative assembly of 68 members, evenly divided between Christians and Muslims. This body in turn accepted a draft constitution put forward by the UN Commissioner on 10th July. On 11th September 1952, Emperor Haile Selassie ratified the constitution. The Representative Assembly subsequently became the Eritrean Assembly. In 1952, UN General Assembly Resolution 390 to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia went into effect. The resolution ignored the wishes of Eritreans for independence, but to guarantee the population some democratic rights and measure of autonomy. Some scholars have contended that the issue was a religious issue between the Muslim lowland population desiring independence, while the highland Christian population sought a union with Ethiopia. Other scholars, including the former Attorney General of Ethiopia, Bereket Selassie, contend that religious tension here and there were exploited by the British, but most Eritreans, Christians and Muslims were united in their goal of freedom and independence. Almost immediately after the federation went into effect, however, these rights began to be abridged or violated. Place in Eritrea for referendum for independence were received by the American, British and Ethiopian government, and a confidential American memo estimated around 75% of Eritreans supported the Independence Party. The details of Eritrea's association with Ethiopia were established by the UN General Assembly Resolution of 2nd December 1950. It called for Eritrea and Ethiopia to be linked through a loose federal structure under the sovereignty of the emperor. Eritrea was to have its own administrative and judicial structure, its own flag and control over its domestic affairs, including police, local administration and taxation. The federal government, which for all intents and purposes was existing imperial government, was to control foreign affairs, including commerce, defense, finance and transportation. As a result of a long history, a strong landowning peasantry and virtual absence of serfdom in most parts of Eritrea, the bulk of Eritreans had developed a distinct sense of cultural identity and superiority vis-a-vis Ethiopians. This, combined with Eritreans who had a desire for political freedoms alien to Ethiopian political tradition, was the reason why the British administration left the country and the Eritreans finally won that fight. From the start of the federation, however, Haile Selassie attempted to undercut Eritrea's independent status, a policy that alienated many Eritreans. The emperor pressured Eritreans' elected chief executive to resign, made Amharic the official language in place of Arabic and Tigrani, determined the use of Eritrean flag, imposed censorship and moved many business out of Eritrea. Finally, in 1962, Haile Selassie pressured the Eritrean Assembly to abolish the federation and join the Imperial Ethiopian fold, much to the dismay of those in Eritrea who favored a more liberal political order. Let's just know more about ELF, which is Eritrean Liberation Front. So I will be using this a lot in the War of Independence, so it's better to first know what it is to make it more easier for you. Eritrean Liberation Front, informally known as JEBA, was the main independence movement in Eritrea, which sought Eritrea's independence from Ethiopia during the 1960s and the early 1970s. In the late 1950s, an unorganized political movement seeking independence was secretly active as small cells, and in July 1960, the ELF was openly established in Cairo by Idris, Muhammad, Andom, and other Eritrean intellectuals and students. In 1961, Hamid, Idris, Awate formed the armed wing of the ELF and declared the armed struggle for independence. Led by Awate, the ELF came into violent conflict with the government on September 1st, 1961, using guerrilla war tactics to continue the struggle. Though the movement posed great problems for the Ethiopian government and army, it was also facing internal political conflicts in the very late 1960s. In the 1970s, a group of its members split the movement and formed the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, a more left-wing rebel movement. By the 1980s, the People's Liberation Front had replaced the original Eritrean Liberation Front as the main rebel group. Following the expulsion of the ELF from Eritrean land, the organization split into three groups: the Eritrean Liberation Front Revolutionary Council, led by Ahmed Nasser, and Eritrean Liberation Front Central Leadership, which eventually united in 1987 with the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and the remaining faction, led by Abdullah Idris, retained the original name. When Eritrea did gain gain independence in the early 1990s, the People's Liberation Front changed into People's Front for Democracy and Justice with the addition of former ELF members, while the balance became a small rebel group in the nether reaches of Sudan. War for Independence. Militant opposition to the incorporation of Eritrea into Ethiopia had begun in the 1958 with the founding of the Eritrean Liberation Movement, an organization made up mainly of students, intellectuals, and urban wage laborers. The ELM, under the leadership of the Eritrean Hamid Idris Awate, engaged in clandestine political activities intended to cultivate resistance into the centralizing policies of the imperial Ethiopian state. By 1962, however, the ELM had been discovered and destroyed by imperial authorities. Emperor Haile Selassie unilaterally dissolved the Eritrean parliament and illegally annexed the country in 1962. The war continued after the Haile Selassie was ousted in a coup in 1974. The Derg, the new Ethiopian government, was a Marxist military junta led by strongman Mengistu Haile Mariam. In 1960, Eritrean exiles in Cairo founded the Eritrean Liberation Front, which led the Eritrean independence struggle during the 1960s. In contrast to the ELM, from the outset, the ELF was bent on waging armed struggle on behalf of Eritrea independence. The ELF was composed mainly of Eritrean Muslims from the rural lowlands in the western edge of the territory. In 1961, the ELF's political character was vague, but radical Arab states such as Syria and Iraq saw Eritrea as predominantly Muslim region struggling to escape Ethiopian oppression and imperial domination. These two countries therefore supplied military and financial assistance to the ELF. The Battle of Adal took place on 1st September 1961 and was the first battle in Eritrean War of Independence. In the battle, the Eritrean Liberation Front, which numbered at only 14, was able to overcome the local Ethiopian forces. Labor weaponry included 1 British and 3 old Italian guns, while the majority of laborers were unarmed. The battle began at 9 a.m. and lasted about 6 hours and is commemorated in Eritrea as Revolution Day. The rebels who participated were Hamid Idris Awate, Abdul Fayyad, Ibrahim Ahmed Kadif, Awad Fayyad, Mohammed Bayrak, Mohammed Adem Hissan, Sare Karuj, Ahmed Fikak, Mohammed Hassan Duhe, Adem Fakurai, Ali Bakit, Idris Muhammad Omar Karai. The ELF initiated military operations in 1961 and intensified its activities in response to the dissolution of the Federation in 1962. By 1967, the ELF had gained considerable support among peasants, particularly in Eritrea's north and west and around the port city of Massawa. Haile Selassie attempted to calm the growing unrest by visiting Eritrea and assuring its inhabitants that they would be treated as equals under the new arrangements. Although they doled out offices, money, and titles mainly to Christian Highlanders in the hope of co-opting would-be Eritrean opponents in early 1967. The Imperial Secret Police of Ethiopia also set up a wide network of informants in Eritrea and conducted disappearances, intimidations, and assassinations among the same populace, driving several prominent political figures into exile. Imperial Police fired live ammunition, killing scores of youngsters during several student demonstrations in Asmara in this time. The Imperial Army also actively perpetrated massacres until the ousting of the emperor by the Derg in 1974. By 1971, ELF activity had become enough of threat that the emperor had declared martial law in Eritrea. He deployed roughly half of the Ethiopian army to contain the struggle. Internal disputes over strategy and tactics eventually led to the ELF's fragmentation and founding in 1972 of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. The leadership of this multi-ethnic movement came to be dominated by leftist Christian descendants who spoke Tigrinya, Eritrea's predominant language. Sporadic armed conflict ensued between the two groups from 1972 to 1974, even as they fought Ethiopian forces by the late 1970s. The EPLF had become the dominant armed Eritrean group fighting against the Ethiopian government, and Isaias Afwerki had emerged as its leader. Much of the material used to combat Ethiopian was captured from the army. By 1977, the EPLF seemed poised to drive the Ethiopians out of Eritrea. However, that same year, a massive airlift of Soviet arms to Ethiopia enabled the Ethiopian army to regain the initiative and forced the EPLF to retreat to the bush. Between 1978 and 1986, the Derg launched 8 unsuccessful major offensives against the independence movement. In 1988, the EPLF captured Alphabet headquarters of Ethiopian army in northern East Eritrea, putting approximately a third of the Ethiopian army out of action, prompting the Ethiopian army to withdraw from its garrisons in Eritrea's western lowlands. EPLF fighters then moved into position around Keren, Eritrea's second largest city. Meanwhile, other descendant movements were making headway throughout Ethiopia at the end of the 1980s. The Soviet Union informed Mengistu that it would not renew its defense and cooperation agreement. With the withdrawal of Soviet support and supplies, the Ethiopian army's morale plummeted, and the EPLF, along with other Ethiopian rebel forces, began to advance an Ethiopian position. In 1980, the Permanent People's Tribunal determined that the right of the Eritrean people to self-determination does not represent a form of secession. Hamid Idris Awate. Hamid Idris Awate, born 10th April 1910 and died on 28th May 1962, was the founder of the Eritrean Army, the armed wing of the Eritrean Liberation Front, and a symbol of the Eritrean struggle for independence. Awate was born in 1910 in Jerset, located between Tesenai and Goluji in southwestern Italian Eritrea. His father, a peasant, trained him as childhood in the use of guns. Hamid was a Tigray and Nara descent. In 1935, Hamid was conscripted by the Italians to serve in the colonial army of the Eritrean Askari. Beside his influence in Arabic, Tigray, Tigrania, Nara, Hedareb, and Kunama, Hamid learned the Italian language very well within the short period of time and was sent to Rome for a course in military intelligence. After returning from Italy, he was appointed as security officer in western Eritrea. Shortly after, he served as deputy chief mayor of the city of Kassala, Sudan, in its surrounding during the brief Italian occupation of that city in 1940 up to 1941 at the beginning of World War II. As mayor of Kassala, he promoted the political union of that city to his country, Eritrea, but Allied offensives at the end of January 1941 forced him to renounce to it. He fought as an Eritrean Askari in the Battle of Keren during World War II and participated in the Italian guerrilla campaign in Eritrea against Allied forces with the cavalrymen of Ali Gabre. After the Italians were completely pushed out of Eritrea, Hamid settled in western Eritrea but eventually went into dispute against the British authorities and began an armed campaign against Britain's control over Eritrea from 1942 to 1948. Afterwards, Hamid and his armed faction came to actual agreement with the British authorities. In the meantime, the Eritrean independence movement was taking shape and working towards making Eritrea an independent country by peaceful means rather than joining landlocked Ethiopia. Aman Andom. Aman Mikhail Andom was an Eritrean general and the first post-imperial acting head of state of Ethiopia. He was appointed to this position following the coup d'etat that ousted Emperor Haile Selassie on 12 September 1974 and served until his death in a shootout with his former supporters. Aman's official title was chairman of the Provisional Military Administrative Council, better known as DERG, and he held the position of head of state in acting capacity as the military regime had officially proclaimed Crown Prince Asfaw Hussein as king designated, an act that would later be rescinded by the DERG and which never accepted by the prince as legitimate. There is some evidence that indicated he had contacts with the officers of the junta as early as February and March 1974, but by July he was appointed chief of staff to the military junta. On September 15th, 3 days after the junta removed the Emperor Haile Selassie from his palace to imprisonment at the headquarters of the 4th Division, this group appointed Aman their chairman and head of state of Ethiopia. At the same time, this group of soldiers assumed the name Provisional Military Administrative Council. From the first day of him becoming chairman, the outways note, the general found himself at odds with majority of the Derg's members over most issues, including whether he was chairman of the ruling military body or simply its spokesman. The man fought the majority of the Derg over 3 central issues: the size of Derg, which he felt was too large and unwieldy, the policy to be taken towards the Eritrean Liberation Front, and over the punishment of the numerous aristocrats and former government officials in the Derg's custody. His refusal to sanction and execution of former high officials, including 2 former prime ministers and several royal family members and relatives, put his relation with the majority of the Derg on an especially bitter footing. And an Eritrean general, Aman, found himself fiercely at odds with the majority of the Derg, wanted to negotiate a peaceful settlement. His opponents hoped to crush the ELF by military force. Aman went as far as making 2 personal visits to Eritrea, the first 25th August to 6th September 1974, the 2nd in November 1974, giving speeches stating that the end of the imperial regime was also the end of the old practices towards Eritrea, and progress would restore peace and prosperity to Eritrea, and lastly that he would begin investigations concerning crimes that the army perpetrated on Eritreans and punish the guilty. However, at the same time the Derg had begun to ask of eliminating opponents with the military. The 3 significant units were the Imperial Bodyguard and Air Force and Corps of Engineers. Of the most recalcitrant were the engineers, so on 7th October 1974, soldiers loyal to the Derg stormed the engineers' camp, killing 5, wounding several and detaining the rest. As Bahru Zwed observation, he said that with that the illusion that the revolution would remain bloodless was exploded. General Aman responded with personal campaign to seek support outside the Derg, among the rest of the army, to the country where he was popular. On 15th November 1974, he sent a message to all military units that was highly critical of the Derg. During a general assembly of the Derg 2 days later, Mengistu Haile Mariam demanded that 5,000 men be dispatched to Eritrea and 6 imprisoned imperial officials be executed. Aman refused, resigned his official post and retired to his house, where he secretly sent appeals to his supporters, especially those in the 3rd Division, but Mengistu managed to intercept their appeals. Petros Solomon is an Eritrean politician who was an Eritrean People's Liberation Front commander during the Eritrean War of Independence, and following independence he served in several positions in the cabinet, including Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has been in prison held incommunicado in an undisclosed location since September 18, 2001 for opposing the rule of Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki. Amnesty International has named him a prisoner of conscience. His wife Aster, who was also a freedom fighter and member of EPLF, was detained by security personnel at Asmara International Airport in the capital Asmara on December 11, 2003, when she returned after a 3-year period of study at the University of Phoenix to unite with her children. She is imprisoned at Karshel in Asmara, Eritrea. All 4 of Solomon's children live in exile. Petros Solomon was a member of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. From 1972 until the end of the Eritrean War of Independence 1991, he served as chief strategist and the head of military intelligence of the EPLF. Also served as the member of the executive committee of EPLF from 1977 to 1994. During the War of Independence, he is credited with having single-handedly organized the EPLF's intelligence section. He is also credited with having been the commander of the Nakf, Kerkevet, and Zara fronts during the war in the early 1980s. He led the Battle of Massawa in 1977. He also, along with Obe Abraha, led the battle to liberate the town of Barentu in 1987. Mesfin Hagos. Mesfin Hagos is an Eritrean who was one of the founding members of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. In government, he was the Eritrean Minister of Defense during the 1990s. After repression by President Isaias Afwerki against Mesfin's colleagues, Mesfin sought political asylum in Germany 2013, where he lived as of December 2020. Mesfin was a founding member of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front in 1977. Before founding that organization, he had joined the Eritrean Liberation Front in 1966 as an ordinary member. He eventually became deputy commander of ELF Zone 5. Mesfin Hegos left the ELF in 1970 with Isaias, Afwerki, Major General Asmerom, Jerez, Solomon, Wald Mariam, and Tewald Ayob. Hegos was a part of the founding leadership of the EPLF. Mesfin Hegos briefly served as the chief of staff in the EPLF. He was one of the commanders of the Battle of Awate that destroyed the backbone of the Ethiopian army. Mesfin later started opposing Afwerki's dictatorial rule and in 2013 sought asylum in Germany after his fellow colleagues opposing the president were hunted down. As of December 2020, Mesfin lived in Germany. Wald Mariam was one of the original proponents of the Eritrean independence movement and an uncompromising advocate of freedom, considered by many Eritreans as fathers of Eritrean nationalism. He worked closely with Ibrahim Sultan Ali after the federation with Ethiopia to secure Eritrean independence. Wald Mariam was one of the original opponents of the Eritrean independence movement. Wald was teacher, journalist, radical revolutionary, a great debater, and uncompromising advocate of freedom. His commitment to individual freedom, democracy, and justice was unshakable, as his commitment to the unity of Eritrea and the dignity of its people. The clarity of his thinking, which was expressed in his newspaper articles of the 1940s, is now available to a new generation, compiled in a book. The book was edited by Tikabo Arsei and published in 1995. Wald Mariam was a devout Christian of the Protestant congregation. In 1942, he left the CEM at the behest of the British military administration, became editor for the Tigrinya language newspaper. After a trip to Addis Ababa, he became a chief opponent of unification with Ethiopia. Chief among his fears of uniting Eritrea with Ethiopia, beside his love of his Eritrean people and country, was the corruption and poverty that he saw when he visited Addis Ababa. In 1946, he brought together Christian and Muslim nationalists to advocate for the independence of Eritrea from Ethiopia. Between 1947 and 1953, he was subjected to 7 assassination attempts. After the federation with Ethiopia by the United Nations, he continued to advocate Eritrean independence by creating mass organization, particularly with the help of labor organizations. In 1953, another attempt was made on his life, suffering injuries which left him hospitalized for 5 months. While in the hospital, he was elected to the National Assembly. However, his election was annulled by Tedla Bairu. After the annulment of the election, he was forced to seek asylum in Egypt. Ruth Simon, born in 1962, is an Eritrean journalist. Simon worked with the Eritrean People's Liberation Front during the Eritrean War of Independence. Heading its separate publication, she also served as an editor-in-chief of the Association for the Reintegration of Eritrean Women Guerrilla Fighters magazine banner. After the war, she was arrested on 25th April in 1997 by Eritrean government while working as a correspondent for Agence France Presse. The US-based Committee to Protect Journalists stated that she had been arrested for reporting an alleged statement by President Isaias Afwerki that Eritrean soldiers were fighting together with Sudanese rebel groups. The People's Front for Democracy and Justice, Afwerki's party, released a statement the day after her report, calling it a gross distortion and stating that Eritrean forces were not participating in the Second Sudanese Civil War. Simon was the first journalist to be arrested in Eritrea since its independence 4 years before. Simon was held without trial until May 1998, when Afwerki announced that the reporter would face trial and the Eritrea would sue AFP for spreading false information through a so-called agent. The Paris-based Reporters Without Borders appealed on her behalf, as did the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and CPG. In November of that year, Simon was awarded a CPG, International Press Freedom Award, in absentia, the first Eritrean to win the award. On 29th December 1998, Simon was released without even having been tried. Simon is divorced and has 3 children. Ibrahim Sultan Ali, born March 1909, was born in Keren, Eritrea. He played a part in the emancipation of the Tigray in Sahel and Barca, and establishing Bloco Independenza. He was also the Secretary General of the Eritrean Democratic Front. Ibrahim worked as the chief in a train station, served as a civil servant in Keren, Agordat, Tessenei, Adiugri, and even Wikro, near Mekele for 6 months. He was proficient in speaking and translating Italian, Arabic, Tigray, and Tigrania. From 1926 to 1941, he was the head of the Islamic Affairs section in the Political Affairs Office under Italian rule. Under the British, he served as head of Civil Native Affairs Office until April 1943. He resigned and established a modern cheese plant in Tessenei, which he ran until the end of 1945. The Eritrean Chamber of Commerce was established that year. And he became one of the senior staff members until the end of September 1946. He represented Eritrea in front of the UN and was one of the leading and strongest members of the ELF. In May 1941, he was a founding member of the Patriotic Association till he helped found the Muslim League of Eritrea on December 3, 1946. The league took Keren as its headquarters till parties were shut down by Ethiopian interference in the late 1950s. Ali, who was a key figure in the establishment of Bloco Independenza, on July 26, 1949 was elected the Secretary General of the organization. In January 1951, he partook in the establishment of the Eritrean Democratic Front and became the Secretary General. He was a member of the first Eritrean Parliament when he won election on May 15 in 1952, representing the Rugbat tribe, of which he was the traditional chief from 1948 to 1950. On September 20, 1949, the United Nations discussing the future Eritrea invited independent bloc Eritrean leaders. Ali made the strongest representation of Eritrean independence. At UN, Ibrahim is quoted to have said, "If a wrong decision is taken forcing us to struggle to safeguard our identity and obtain our independence, then the members of this committee will shoulder the responsibility for the hostilities that arise in East Africa." Wald Mariam said 90% of the credit of preserving Eritrea in one piece goes to Ibrahim Sultan Ali. He added, "Ibrahim Sultan is a heroic patriot who deserves the praise, the gratitude of the entire Eritrean people." Mahmoud Ahmed Sharifo. Mahmoud Ahmed Sharifo, commonly known simply as Sharifo, born in 1948, served briefly as the head of state of Eritrea while the president was away. He joined the Eritrean Liberation Front in 1967. He was an independent activist during Eritrea's War of Independence from Ethiopia. Post-independence, served in various capacities as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Local Government. In September 2001, he was detained indefinitely along with the other politicians who were known as the G15, a group which opposed the rule of Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki. Mahmoud, along with 15 other ministers, were arrested by the ruling front and detained in an unknown location ever since. The ministers were criticizing the border war of the then President Isaias and signed an open letter. Amnesty International had named him a prisoner of conscience and called for his immediate release in 2011. He joined the Eritrean Liberation Front in 1967. He was an independent activist during Eritrea's War of Independence from Ethiopia. Post-independence, he served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs before his last posting as Minister of Local Government. During his time, he was also appointed chairman of the committee to prepare the draft laws concerning the first round of national elections and political party laws. Once the drafts were completed, the chairman of the National Assembly and President Isaias Afwerki summoned a report on the drafts. Mahmoud Ahmed Sharif was detained for his lazy role, schemes that occurred on May 19, 1993, and for orchestrating a coup d'etat in 2001. Aster Fissehatsion is an Eritrean politician and Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. She is the former wife of former Vice President of Eritrea, Mahmoud Ahmed Sharif. She was detained in September 2001 for being part of the G15. On 18 September 2001, she was detained indefinitely along with other politicians of G15, a group which opposed the rule of Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki. Aster, along with other 15 ministers, were detained in a known location ever since. The ministers were criticizing the border war of the then president, Isaias, and signed an open letter. She joined Eritrean People's Liberation Front in 1974 and became a leading figure in the struggle for independence in Eritrea. Following independence, she held the following position: member of the Central Council of People's Front of Democracy and Justice. In 1994, the EPLF changed its name to PFDG, member of the National Assembly, director of the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. In 1996, Fissehatsion was dismissed from her job for criticizing the increasingly authoritarian government, but was reinstated in 1999. In May 2001, she was one of the 15 senior party officials, later known as the G15, who published an open letter calling peaceful and democratic dialogue and calling on President Isaias Afwerki to adhere to correct parliamentary and governance procedures, hold internal party meetings, and keep the promises made by the PFDG in respect of judicial reform. Isaias Afwerki is an Eritrean politician and partisan who has been the president of Eritrea since shortly after he led the Eritrean People's Liberation Front to victory in May 1991, ending the 30-year-old war for independence from Ethiopia. Born 2nd February 1946, Isaias attended Prince Makonnen High School. In the early 1960s, he joined the nationalist Eritrean student movement. In 1965, he began his studies at the College of Engineering at the Haile Selassie I University in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He is a member of the Eritrean Orthodox Church, one of the 4 Lego churches in Eritrea. In addition to being president, Isaias is the chairman of Eritrea's sole Lego political party at the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. As Eritrea has no functioning constitution, no elections, no legislature, and no published budget, Isaias is the sole power in the country, controlling its judiciary and military. Scholars and historians consider him to be a dictator, with his regime being described as totalitarianism by way of forced conscription and being cited for human rights violations by the United Nations and Amnesty International. In 2021, Reporters Without Borders ranked Eritrea under the government of Isaias last out of 180 countries in the Press Freedom Index. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Thank you.